The night had settled gently over Baker Street, like a soft blanket drawn across the city. For faint mist lingered in the air, catching the glow of the gas lamps and turning each light into a quiet halo. From the window of 21B, the world seemed distant, softened, almost dreamlike. Inside, the familiar warmth of the sitting room wrapped itself around every object. The fire in the hearth burned low, its embers glowing a deep, steady orange. Shadows moved lazily along the walls, stretching and shrinking with each subtle flicker of flame. I sat in my usual chair, a book resting loosely in my hands, though I had not turned a page for quite some time. The hour was late, approaching midnight, and the stillness of London had a peculiar way of encouraging reflection. Even the usual sounds of carriage wheels and distant voices had faded into near silence. Across from me, Sherlock Holmes reclined in his armchair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed. To the casual observer, he might have appeared to be resting, but I had long since learned that Holmes was rarely ever idle. The only sound between us was the soft, rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock. Tick, tick, tick. It was a comforting sound, predictable, unchanging, and then a knock. It came quietly at first, so soft, in fact, that I wondered if I had imagined it. I lifted my gaze toward Holmes, but he did not move. His expression remained unchanged, as though the sound had not reached him at all. I waited. The silence returned, deeper now, as though the house itself were listening. Then again, a knock. This time it was clearer. 3 gentle taps against the front door below, not hurried, not forceful, simply deliberate. I set my book aside. "Holmes," I said softly, "did you hear?" "I did," he replied, without opening his eyes. His voice was calm, almost expectant. I rose from my chair and crossed the room, pausing only briefly at the window. The street outside lay quiet and empty. The mist had thickened slightly, drifting in slow, wandering currents beneath the lamps. No figure stood at the door. No movement disturbed the stillness. "Curious," I murmured. Behind me, Holmes shifted just slightly. "Pray, do not hurry, Watson," he said. "Observe first, act later." I nodded, though he could not see it, and turned back toward the door. The knocking did not come again. Carefully, I made my way downstairs, each step measured, the wooden stairs creaking softly beneath my weight. The air below felt cooler, touched by the faint draft that always lingered in the entrance. When I reached the door, I paused. There is, in such moments, a peculiar sensation, something between anticipation and hesitation, not fear, precisely, but a quiet awareness that something is not as it should be. I opened the door. The street beyond was empty. No footsteps echoed. No figure retreated into the fog. Only the pale glow of the lamps and the slow, drifting mist remained. I stepped just outside, glancing left, then right. Nothing. And yet, there was something. At the edge of the doorway, resting neatly upon the stone step, lay a small object, a folded piece of paper. I bent down and picked it up. It was dry, untouched by the damp air, as though it had been placed there only moments before. For a brief second, I looked out once more into the quiet street. Still nothing, no sound, no movement. Only the night, watching. I closed the door and returned upstairs, the paper held lightly between my fingers. Holmes had not moved from his chair. "Well?" he asked. "There was no one," I said, "but this was left behind." I handed him the note. He took it without haste, turning it once in his hand before unfolding it with careful precision. His eyes moved across the page, and for the briefest moment, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, not concern, but interest, a quiet, unmistakable interest. Holmes leaned back slightly, the firelight catching in his eyes. "It says very little, my dear Watson," he replied softly. He placed the paper upon the table between us. I leaned forward to read. There were only a few words, written in a steady, deliberate hand. Tomorrow, midnight. Nothing more. No name. No explanation. Just a time and promise. The clock continued its gentle rhythm. Ick, tick, tick, and somewhere beyond the fog-covered street, unseen and unheard, someone had already gone. The following day passed with an unusual quiet. It was not the ordinary calm of Baker Street, nor the gentle stillness that often accompanied the close of a case. Rather, it was a silence that seemed expectant, as though the hours themselves were merely a prelude to something yet to arrive. I found myself glancing at the clock more often than I cared to admit. Holmes, by contrast, appeared entirely at ease. He spent the morning as he often did, moving between his chemical apparatus and the window, occasionally pausing to jot down a note in his precise, elegant hand. At one point, he took up his violin, drawing from it a slow, thoughtful melody that seemed to drift through the rooms like the fading mist of the previous night. "You are not curious, Holmes?" I asked at last, unable to restrain myself. "On the contrary, my dear Watson," he replied, adjusting a vial with delicate care. "I am very curious indeed." "And yet you do nothing," he smiled faintly. "My good fellow, I am doing exactly what is required." I glanced toward the small folded note, still resting upon the table where he had left it. Tomorrow, midnight. It seemed almost absurd in its simplicity, and yet it lingered in the mind. The day waned slowly. Afternoon softened into evening, and evening into night. The familiar glow of the lamps returned, casting their steady light upon the street below. Once again, the mist began to gather, thin at first, then thickening as the hour grew late. By the time the clock approached midnight, the world beyond our window had become a quiet blur of shadow and gold. Holmes had resumed his place in the armchair. I remained seated nearby, though my book lay forgotten once more. Neither of us spoke. The ticking of the clock seemed louder tonight. Tick, tick, then a knock. This time there was no mistaking it. 3 soft taps, measured, even, almost polite. I rose immediately, my gaze flicking toward Holmes. He did not look at me. "Go on, Watson," he said gently. "But take note of everything." I nodded and made my way downstairs, my steps slower now, more deliberate than the night before. The air felt cooler again, carrying with it that same faint sense of anticipation. When I reached the door, I paused only briefly, then opened it. The street lay before me, unchanged, empty, silent. The mist moved softly through the lamplight, curling and shifting as though alive, but revealing nothing beyond its veil. "No one," I murmured under my breath. And yet, again, just at the edge of the step, something had been left behind. Another folded piece of paper. I crouched slightly, picking it up with care. It felt identical to the first, same size, same texture. Whoever had placed it there had done so with remarkable precision and remarkable silence. I stepped out just a little farther this time, my eyes scanning the street more carefully. A faint sound reached me then, not footsteps, not quite, more like the distant echo of movement, soft, receding, already gone. I straightened slowly, the note still in my hand, and allowed myself one final look into the fog. There was no trace of the visitor, only the quiet street and the steady glow of the lamps. When I returned upstairs, Holmes was watching the fire. "Well?" he asked. "Again, no one," I said, handing him the note. "But there is something I did not hear last night, a sound, very faint, as though someone had just departed." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Excellent, Watson." He unfolded the paper with the same careful motion as before. His eyes moved across it, and once again that subtle expression of interest returned. "And this time?" I asked. He placed the note beside the first. "Consistency," he said, "a most reassuring quality." I leaned forward. The message was written in the same steady hand. "Midnight. Do not follow." A small, curious chill passed through me. "Do not follow," I repeated. "That is an unusual request, is it not?" Holmes rested his fingertips together, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window. "Not a request, Watson," he said softly. "A precaution." "For whom?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he rose from his chair and crossed to the window, parting the curtain just slightly. He stood there for a moment, looking out into the mist. "The interesting question," he said at last, "is not why our visitor wishes to remain unseen." He let the curtain fall back into place. "But rather, why he wishes us to know that he is there at all." I considered this in silence. The fire crackled softly behind us. The clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Holmes returned to his chair, though he did not sit immediately. "Tomorrow night," he said, "we shall make a small adjustment." I looked up. "What sort of adjustment?" At this, he allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "One that I believe our midnight visitor has already anticipated." He settled back into the armchair, closing his eyes once more. And though the room returned to its familiar quiet, though the fire burned low and the night carried on undisturbed, there was now, unmistakably, a sense that we were no longer merely observing the mystery, but gently, steadily, becoming a part of it. The third day unfolded with a quiet intention. There are moments in one's life with Sherlock Holmes when the atmosphere changes, not dramatically, nor with any visible urgency, but in a subtle, deliberate way. It is as though an invisible thread has been drawn tighter, connecting events that have yet to fully reveal themselves. This was such a day. Holmes spoke little during breakfast. His attention seemed divided between his thoughts and the world beyond the window. From time to time he would glance toward the street below, not searching, but observing, as though committing every detail to memory. "Holmes," I said eventually, "you mentioned an adjustment." "Yes, Watson," he replied calmly, stirring his tea, "a minor one." "And you believe our visitor expects it?" "I am quite certain of it." There was something in his tone, not secrecy exactly, but restraint. Holmes often allowed a mystery to unfold at its own pace, revealing only what was necessary, when it was necessary. And so, I did not press him further. The hours drifted by, afternoon light faded gently into evening, and with it came the now familiar arrival of mist. It gathered once more along Baker Street, softening the edges of the world and dimming the distance between light and shadow. Inside 221B, however, something had changed. At Holmes' quiet instruction, the sitting room had been left in near darkness. The fire burned lower than usual, reduced to a faint, steady glow. The lamps were unlit. Even the curtains had been drawn only partially, allowing just a thin suggestion of the outside light to slip through. We sat not in our usual places, but further back, beyond immediate view of the window, waiting. "You intend for the room to appear empty," I said softly. Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely. And if our visitor enters, he will not." His certainty was as calm as ever. The clock marked the passing minutes with its familiar rhythm. Tick, tick. There is a peculiar stillness that accompanies such waiting. It is not discomforting, not even tense, but rather a deep quiet in which every small sound becomes distinct. The soft settling of wood, the faint whisper of the fire, the distant murmur of the city, carried through layers of fog. And then midnight approached. Holmes did not move. Neither did I. The air itself seemed to pause. Then a knock, soft, measured, 3 gentle taps. But this time something was different. The sound did not seem to come from below. It was closer, subtler, as though it had not struck the door with the same firmness as before. Holmes's eyes opened slowly. "Now, Watson," he murmured. I rose quietly, moving not toward the stairs, but toward the window. Carefully, I drew the curtain aside just enough to see. At first, there was nothing, only the mist, drifting as it had the nights before. But then, a shape, faint, indistinct, standing just beyond the reach of the nearest lamp, not approaching, not retreating, simply present. I held my breath. "Do you see him?" Holmes's voice came softly from behind me. "Yes," I whispered. "A figure in fog. Describe. Tall, perhaps. Still, I cannot make out the face." "Just so," Holmes said. The figure did not move. Seconds passed, perhaps longer. Time, in such moments, has a curious way of stretching. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figure inclined its head, not toward the house, but toward the window, toward us. Nothing more. And then it stepped back, one step, then another, until the mist closed gently around it, gone. I remained at the window for a moment longer, my eyes searching the place where the figure had stood. But there was nothing to be seen, only the soft glow of the lamps and the empty street. Behind me, Holmes rose at last. "Fascinating," he said quietly. "You expected this?" I asked, turning toward him. "I expected restraint," he replied, "but not courtesy. Holmes moved past me and glanced briefly out into the fog. "Our visitor, Watson, does not wish to intrude," he said. "He announces himself, leaves his message, and withdraws. Then why tonight?" I asked. "Why remain visible at all?" Holmes considered this for a moment. "Because," he said slowly, "we altered the pattern." I frowned slightly, and he responded in kind. "Exactly." Holmes turned back toward the room, his expression thoughtful. "No note tonight," he added. I blinked. "You are certain?" He gestured lightly toward the door below. There was no sound of placement, no pause, no departure from the step. I realized then that he was correct. The pattern had changed. Again, the clock resumed its steady rhythm. Tick, tick. Holmes returned to his chair, though he did not sit immediately. "Our visitor grows more confident," he said. "Or more cautious," I suggested. A faint smile touched his lips. "My dear Watson," he said softly, "in this case, I suspect that the two are very much the same." The fire gave a quiet crackle. The mist drifted on beyond the glass. And somewhere in the depths of that silent London night, the distance between watcher and visitor had grown just a little smaller. The fourth day began not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. There are moments, in the company of Sherlock Holmes, when the unknown no longer feels distant. It does not vanish, nor does it fully reveal itself, but it begins to take shape, like an outline slowly emerging through mist. Holmes rose earlier than usual that morning. I found him already dressed, standing near the window, watching Baker Street as the first pale light of dawn settled across the rooftops. The fog of the previous night had thinned, leaving behind a clarity that felt almost deliberate. "You did not sleep," I observed. "A little," he replied. "Enough?" His tone suggested that sleep had not been his priority. "And the visitor?" I asked. "You have formed a conclusion." "Not a conclusion," Holmes said, turning slightly. "A direction." He moved back toward the table where the two notes still lay side by side. "Tomorrow, midnight, do not follow." Holmes rested his fingers lightly upon them. "Repetition," he murmured. "Structure, restraint. You believe there is a pattern?" "My dear Watson," he said gently, "there is always a pattern." The day passed with an unusual activity, though not the kind one might expect. Holmes did not rush into the streets, nor did he summon informants or pursue inquiries in the usual fashion. Instead, he remained within the quiet comfort of 221B, occasionally stepping out only briefly and always returning without explanation. At one point, he asked Mrs. Hudson a most curious question regarding the front step. "Has anything been disturbed?" he inquired. "Any marks, however slight?" Miss Hudson, though puzzled, assured him that she had noticed nothing at all. "No mud, sir, no scuffs, nothing out of place." Holmes thanked her with a small nod. When she had gone, he turned to me. "You see, Watson, I see that our visitor is careful," I replied. "Exceptionally so." Holmes allowed himself a faint smile, and yet not invisible. As evening approached, the now familiar mist returned, drifting softly through the street. It seemed almost as though it had become a participant in the matter, an ever-present veil between what was seen and what was merely suggested. This time, however, Holmes made a different arrangement. "We shall not wait in darkness tonight," he said. Instead, the lamps were lighted, the fire burned a little brighter, the room appeared as it always had, warm, welcoming, undisturbed, and we took our usual places. "Will that not discourage him?" I asked. Holmes shook his head slightly. "No, Watson, it will reassure him." I considered this quietly. The clock resumed its steady rhythm. Tick, tick. There is something deeply calming in routine. Even in the presence of mystery, the familiar patterns of sound and light have a way of settling the mind. Perhaps that is why, when the moment came, it felt almost inevitable. Midnight. And then a knock. 3 gentle taps, unhurried, unmistakable. I rose at once, though this time I felt no hesitation, only a quiet curiosity and something else, recognition. Holmes remained seated. "Observe," he said softly. I descended the stairs as once more, my steps steady, the air cool and still. At the door, I paused only briefly before opening it. The street was empty, as before, and yet not entirely unchanged, for there, upon the step, lay another folded note. I picked it up carefully, but this time I did not step outside. Instead, I allowed my gaze to linger just beyond the threshold, and then I noticed it. Not a footprint, not a mark, but the faintest disturbance in the mist itself, as though something had passed through it only moments before, leaving behind not a trace upon the ground, but a subtle shift in the air. I closed the door gently and returned upstairs. Holmes looked up as I entered. "Well?" he asked. "The same," I said, handing him the note. "But the mist, It moved, as though he had only just gone. Holmes accepted the paper, unfolding it with calm precision. "Closer, then," he murmured. "And the message?" I asked. He placed it beside the others. I leaned forward to read. "You are observed." A quiet stillness settled over the room. "Observed?" I repeated. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful but untroubled. "Yes," he said softly, "and quite deliberately so. You do not find that concerning? On the contrary, Watson," he replied. "I find it most illuminating." He gestured lightly toward the 3 notes. "Consider the progression," he continued. "First, an introduction, then a boundary, and now an acknowledgement. Of us? Precisely." The fire crackled softly. The clock continued its gentle rhythm. Tick, tick. I looked once more at the notes, their meaning beginning to settle into place. "This is no random visitor," I said quietly. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly in the firelight. "No," he agreed, "it is not." He rose slowly and moved toward the window, gazing out into the drifting mist. "For the first time, Watson," he said, his voice calm and certain, "our visitor is no longer merely leaving messages." He paused, and then, very softly, "he is beginning a conversation." The night carried on undisturbed, but within the quiet walls of 221B, something had shifted, not in sound, not in movement, but in understanding. And the distance between seen and the unseen had grown smaller still. By the 5th day, the matter had taken on most unusual quality. It was no longer merely a curiosity, nor even a mystery in the traditional sense. Instead, it had become something gentler, something more deliberate, a correspondence, unspoken, unseen, yet unmistakably present. I watched as Sherlock Holmes arranged the 3 notes once more upon the table. He studied them not as clues alone, but as one might study a letter written in the careful, restrained hand, each word placed with intention, each silence equally meaningful. "Tomorrow, midnight. Midnight. Do not follow. You are observed." "You see it now, Watson," he said quietly. "I see that we are being drawn into something," I replied, "but I cannot yet say what." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Nor can I, entirely," he admitted. "But I believe it is time we respond." "Respond?" I echoed. "Yes." He turned from the table and moved toward his writing desk. Selecting a single sheet of paper, he paused only briefly before taking up his pen. "What will you say?" I asked. Holmes allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. "As little as possible." The pen moved, with quiet precision, no hesitation, no correction. When he had finished, he folded the paper once, then again, and placed it neatly upon the edge of the mantel. "You intend to leave it for him?" I asked. "Not quite," Holmes replied. "We shall meet him halfway." The day passed with a curious calm. There was no urgency in Holmes's movements, no sudden bursts of deduction or restless pacing. Instead, he carried himself with the same quiet patience that had defined the past few days, as though he understood that whatever this encounter was to become, it could not be hurried. Evening arrived, and with it, the now familiar mist. But tonight, something felt different, not in the air, nor in the light, but in the sense of expectation. The room at 221B remained softly lit, the fire steady, the chairs in their usual places. Nothing had been altered, and yet everything had. Holmes stood near the door as midnight approached, the folded note held lightly between his fingers. "You will open the door at once," he said. "And you?" I asked. "I shall remain here." There was no tension in his voice, only calm certainty. The clock began its slow approach. Tick, 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 and then midnight. The knock came, as it always had, 3 gentle taps. No louder, no softer, unchanged. I moved without hesitation this time, descending the stairs with a steady step. The air below felt familiar now, cool, still, quietly expectant. When I reached the door, I did not pause. I opened it at once. The street lay before me, veiled in mist, empty, and yet there was a presence, not seen, but felt, subtle, near. I stepped just slightly aside, leaving the doorway open, and for a moment nothing happened. The mist drifted softly, the lamps glowed, the night remained undisturbed. Then, from just beyond the edge of sight, a movement, a figure, emerging only partially from the fog, not approaching fully, not retreating, simply there. I could not make out the face, only the outline, the stillness, the quiet restraint. I felt no fear, only a strange calm. Slowly, I extended my hand, placing Holmes' folded note upon the stone step. Then I withdrew, stepping back inside, leaving the door open. Seconds passed, perhaps longer. The figure did not move at first. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, it stepped forward, just enough. A gloved hand emerged from the mist. It reached down and took the note. There was no haste, no sound, only the faintest suggestion of motion against the quiet night. The hand withdrew. The figure paused, and then, for the briefest moment, it inclined its head, a gesture not of secrecy, nor of warning, but of acknowledgement, respectful, measured, and then it was gone. The mist closed gently once more. The street returned to stillness. I stood there for a moment longer before closing the door softly behind me. When I returned upstairs, Holmes had not moved. "Well?" he asked. "He took it," I said, "and he acknowledged it." Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already understood. "Good," he said quietly. "And now?" I asked. Holmes leaned back slightly, his gaze thoughtful. "Now, Watson, we wait." The fire gave a soft crackle. The clock resumed its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, and though the night carried on as it always had, there was now a quiet certainty within those walls. The silence between us and the unseen visitor was no longer empty. It had been answered. There are silences, I have often found, that speak more clearly than words. The morning following our quiet exchange with the unseen visitor carried such a silence. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something unspoken, an understanding that had begun to form, delicate and incomplete. I awoke earlier than usual. The light outside was pale and diffused, softened by a lingering veil of mist that had not yet lifted from the street. Within the sitting room of 2021B, everything appeared as it always had: the chairs, the mantel, the faint glow of embers resting low in the hearth. And yet, the air felt different. Holmes was already awake. Sherlock Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the muted light. He did not turn as I entered, but I knew at once that he was aware of me. "You are awake early, Watson," he said quietly. "As are you," I replied. A brief pause followed. "Did you expect a reply?" I asked. Holmes considered this. "Yes," he said at last, "though not immediately. And yet you seem certain that one will come." He inclined his head slightly. "Our visitor has shown us consistency, restraint, and intention. It would be most unlike him to break that pattern now." I moved closer to the table. The 3 notes remained where they had been placed, undisturbed. Beside them, however, there was now an empty space, a subtle absence where Holmes's own reply had rested before being carried away into the mist. You believe he will answer tonight? I asked. Holmes turned then, his expression calm. I believe, he said, that he already has. The statement lingered in the air, quiet and deliberate. What do you mean? I asked. Holmes stepped away from the window and crossed the room with unhurried ease. He gestured lightly toward the door below. Consider, Watson, he said, the nature of our exchange. Each message thus far has been delivered with care and at a precise moment. Midnight, I said, precisely. And yet, last night, the pattern shifted. I reflected on this. There was no note left behind, I said slowly. Holmes's eyes brightened, just slightly. Just so. And you believe that was intentional? My dear Watson, he replied gently, everything about our visitor is intentional. He moved to the mantel, resting one hand lightly upon its edge. In leaving no reply, he has already replied. I considered this in silence. A refusal, I suggested. Holmes shook his head. No, not refusal. Then what? A pause, he said, a measured one. The day unfolded with an almost meditative calm. Holmes did not pursue the matter outwardly. There were no sudden departures, no urgent inquiries. Instead, he remained within the quiet comfort of our rooms, occasionally consulting his notes or gazing thoughtfully into the fire. At one point, he took up his violin once more. The melody he played was softer than usual, slower, as though it were less a performance and more a reflection. The notes drifted through the room like the mist outside, gentle, unhurried, and faintly distant. I found myself listening without thought, the music settling the mind in a way that words could not. When the final note faded, Holmes lowered the instrument. He is uncertain, he said. About what? I asked. About us. Evening came, and with it, the quiet return of routine. The lamps were lit, the fire stirred gently. The chairs resumed their familiar positions. Nothing was altered, nothing was forced, and yet we waited. The clock marked the passing time. Tick, tick, tick. As midnight approached, I felt no tension, only a quiet awareness. The events of the previous nights had settled into a rhythm, one that felt almost natural. Then the hour arrived, but no knock came. The silence remained unbroken. I glanced toward Holmes. He did not move. Holmes, I said softly. There is nothing. Just so, he replied. Minutes passed. The stillness deepened. Outside, the mist drifted as it always had, untouched, untroubled. No visitor, I said at last. Holmes leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful but composed. No, he agreed. And yet you do not seem surprised. On the contrary, Watson, he said quietly, this is precisely what I expected. I frowned slightly. You expected nothing? Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. I expected restraint, he said. And tonight, restraint has taken the form of absence. The clock continued its gentle rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. I looked once more toward the door, then the window, then back to Holmes. What does it mean? I asked. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, as though listening not to the room, but to the silence itself. It means, he said softly, that the space between words is where the true message lies. The fire gave a quiet crackle. The night carried on, undisturbed. And though nothing had happened, no knock, no note, no shadow in the mist, the conversation had not ended. It had simply deepened. The seventh day arrived with a softness that felt almost deliberate. There had been no knock the night before, no note, no shadow in the mist. And yet, the absence had not diminished the mystery. It had only deepened it. like a quiet breath drawn in and held. I awoke to find the sitting room filled with pale morning light. The fog had lifted for the first time in several days, revealing Baker Street in clear detail. The lamps stood unlit, the pavement dry, the world ordinary once more. And yet, within 2021B, the sense of quiet expectation remained. Sherlock Holmes sat near the window, a cup of untouched tea resting beside him. His gaze was not fixed on any one point, but rather moved slowly, thoughtfully, as though he were observing not the street itself, but the memory of it. "You anticipated the silence," I said, taking my seat. "I did," Holmes replied. "And now?" He considered for a moment. "Now, Watson, we allow the pattern to restore itself." The words were simple, but they carried a certain weight. "You believe he will return tonight?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Yes, and the absence, what purpose did it serve?" "To remind us," he said gently, "that this exchange is not governed by our expectations, but by his." I nodded slowly. There was a calm logic in it. The visitor was not reacting impulsively. He was choosing each moment with care, when to appear, when to remain unseen, and when to say nothing at all. The day unfolded quietly. Holmes did not speak further of the matter, nor did he alter his routine. He read for a time, then wrote a brief note of his own, though this one he did not share. At length he returned to the armchair and closed his eyes, as though resting, though I suspected his mind was far from idle. As for myself, I found a certain stillness settling in. The urgency that might once have accompanied such a mystery had faded, replaced by something far more soothing, a quiet curiosity, free from pressure or haste. Even the passing hours seemed to move more gently. Evening came. The fog returned, though not as thick as before. It drifted lightly across the street, softening the edges of the world without concealing it entirely. Inside, the room remained unchanged. The fire burned low, the lamps glowed warmly, the chairs stood as they always had. Holmes and I resumed our places without discussion. The clock marked time. Tick, tick, tick. There was no need to speak. We both knew. Midnight approached. And then a knock, soft, measured, familiar. 3 gentle taps. I felt no surprise this time, only recognition. Holmes opened his eyes. "Go, Watson," he said quietly. I rose and made my way downstairs, my steps calm, unhurried. The air near the door felt cool, as it always had, carrying with it that faint sense of presence. Just beyond reach, I opened the door. The street lay before me, and for a moment I saw nothing. Then a figure, clearer now than before, not hidden entirely within the mist, but standing just beyond it, as though choosing to be seen, still, composed, waiting. I did not step outside, nor did the figure move closer. Between us lay only a few feet of empty space, and something else, understanding. For several quiet seconds we remained as we were, then slowly, deliberately, the figure raised a hand, not in warning, not in greeting, but in a gesture that seemed almost thoughtful. And then it stepped forward, just enough to reach the edge of the step. A folded piece of paper was placed gently upon the stone. The hand withdrew. The figure paused once more, and though I could not see a face, I sensed no urgency, no fear, only calm. Then, as before, it stepped back and vanished into the soft drift of the night. I remained where I stood for a moment longer, before bending to pick up the note. It felt as the others had, light, deliberate, precise. I returned upstairs. Holmes looked up at once. "He has returned," I said. "Of course." Holmes replied softly. I handed him the note. He unfolded it with care. His eyes moved across the page and then stilled. Well? I asked. Holmes placed the note beside the others. I leaned forward to read. This time, the message was longer, not by much, but enough. You listened, nothing more. I frowned slightly. Listened? I repeated. Holmes leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Yes, he said quietly. That is precisely what we have done. You believe the silence was a test? Holmes inclined his head. Not a test, Watson. An invitation. To what? Holmes's gaze drifted briefly toward the window. To understand, he said. The clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tack. I looked once more at the note, its meaning settling gently into place. This was no longer merely a sequence of messages. It was a dialogue, conducted in stillness. A conversation not of words, but of timing, presence, and restraint. And now, for the first time, it seemed that we had answered correctly. The fire gave a soft crackle. The mist drifted quietly beyond the glass, and somewhere within that calm, unseen distance, our visitor was no longer just watching. He was listening, too. There is a certain quiet that follows understanding, not the kind that comes from answers fully formed, but the kind that settles in gently, when something once distant begins to feel close. The 8th day carried that quiet. The note from the previous night rested upon the table, its message simple and unadorned. You listened. I found myself returning to those words more than once, reading them not for what they said, but for what they implied. He proves, I said at last, glancing toward Sherlock Holmes. Holmes, seated comfortably in his armchair, regarded the fire rather than the note. Approval is perhaps too strong a word, he replied, but acknowledgement, yes, and that brings us closer. Holmes allowed a faint smile. It brings us nearer. The day unfolded without urgency. Holmes spoke little, though I noticed his attention was more focused than before. Not restless, not hurried, but attentive in a deeper sense, as though he were no longer observing the mystery from a distance, but standing quietly within it. At one point, he rose and moved to the window, studying the street below with unusual care. What do you see? I asked. Continuity, he said softly. I joined him. The street appeared as it always had, passers-by moving at an unhurried pace, the occasional carriage rolling by, the quiet rhythm of London life undisturbed. Nothing seems altered, I said. Precisely, Holmes replied. And yet, something is. He turned away from the window. Our visitor has not chosen this place by accident, Watson. You believe Baker Street itself is significant? Holmes inclined his head. Not merely the street, but the vantage it provides. The remark lingered with me. A vantage, a place not only to approach, but to observe and to be observed. Evening came once more, bringing with it the now familiar drift of mist. It settled lightly across the street, less dense than before, allowing the lamps to shine with a clearer, steadier glow. Inside, the room remained unchanged. The fire burned gently. The lamps cast their warm light. The chairs welcomed us back into their quiet familiarity. Holmes and I took our places, without discussion. The clock marked the passing time. Tick, tick. There was a calm certainty now. Where once there had been curiosity, we did not wonder if the visitor would come. We waited, knowing. Midnight approached. The room remained still, and then a knock, soft, measured, 3 gentle taps. Holmes did not speak. I rose and made my way downstairs, my steps steady, the moment familiar, and yet subtly different. When I reached the door, I opened it at once. The street lay before me. But this time, The figure was already there, not hidden within the mist, not distant, but standing clearly at the edge of the step, closer than ever before. For a brief moment, I did not move, nor did the figure. We stood separated by only a small space now, the threshold between inside and out, between known and unknown. I could see more of him now, the outline of a coat, the stillness of his posture, the faint suggestion of a face, though still obscured by shadow, and yet there was no threat, only calm. Slowly, the figure reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. He stepped forward, just enough to place it upon the step. Then, instead of withdrawing at once, he remained, waiting. I felt a quiet shift within me, not uncertainty, but recognition. This was different. Gently, I bent and picked up the note. When I straightened, the figure had not moved. For a moment, I considered speaking, but something held me back. Not fear, not hesitation, but understanding. Words were not required. Instead, I inclined my head just slightly. Figure responded in kind, a mirrored gesture, simple, respectful. Then, at last, he stepped back. The mist received him once more, soft and unhurried, and he was gone. When I returned upstairs, Holmes looked up immediately. He remained, I said, longer than before. Holmes nodded. And closer? Yes. I handed him the note. He unfolded it with care. His eyes moved across the page, and for the first time, he did not speak at once. Well? I asked softly. Holmes placed the note beside the others. I leaned forward to read. This time, the message was different. Not merely a statement, but something more. You understand the distance. I sat back slowly. The distance, I repeated. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. Yes, he said quietly. That is the heart of it. I am not certain I follow. Holmes's eyes shifted briefly toward the window, where the mist continued its slow, drifting motion. The distance between presence and absence, between observer and observed, between approach and restraint. He paused. And now, Watson, that distance is nearly gone. The clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. I looked once more at the note. The words were simple, and yet they carried a quiet weight. For the first time since the beginning of this strange and gentle mystery, it felt as though the end was no longer hidden, but waiting, just beyond the threshold. There is a moment, in every quiet unfolding, when what has long remained just beyond reach finally draws near enough to be touched, not grasped, not seized, but gently understood. The 9th day carried that feeling with it from the very first light. The notes lay arranged upon the table, their messages forming a soft progression, each one a step, each one a pause, each one a careful movement closer. Tomorrow, midnight, midnight, do not follow. You are observed, you listened, you understand the distance. I stood for some time regarding them, aware now that they were not merely clues, but a conversation written across nights. Behind me, Sherlock Holmes moved quietly about the room. It is nearly complete, he said. I turned. You believe tonight will end it? Holmes paused, considering. Not end it, Watson, he replied softly. Resolve it. The distinction lingered. There are endings that close a matter, and there are resolutions that simply allow it to settle, like mist dissolving into morning air. This, I felt, would be the latter. The day passed with an unusual stillness. Holmes spoke little, though there was a calm certainty in his movements now. Whatever had once been uncertain had taken shape within his mind, not as a sudden revelation, but as something that had been quietly assembling itself all along. At one point, he gathered the notes together, aligning them carefully before placing them aside. "You will not take them tonight?" I asked. "No," he said. "They have served their purpose, and we—" Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "We shall do the same." Evening arrived gently. The fog returned, though thinner than before, as though even it had grown lighter with each passing night. The lamps shone steadily, their glow stretching further along the street. Inside, the room was as it had always been. The fire burned low. The lamps cast their warm light. The quiet comfort of 2021B remained unchanged. And yet, there was a sense of nearing. The clock marked the passing time. Tick, tick, tick. Holmes remained seated, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. "Tonight," he said quietly, "you will not go alone." I looked at him. "You intend to come to the door?" He inclined his head. "Yes." Midnight approached. The air felt still, not heavy, not tense, but calm, as though the night itself were waiting. And then a knock, soft, measured, 3 gentle taps. Holmes rose at once. "Come, Watson." Together we descended the stairs, our steps quiet, unhurried. At the door, Holmes paused only briefly, then opened it. The street lay before us, and there, closer than ever before, stood the figure, no longer obscured by mist, no longer distant, but present, clear, still. For a moment, none of us moved. The space between us was small now, the threshold narrow. Holmes stepped forward slightly, though he did not cross it. "My friend," he said gently, his voice calm and even, "you have taken great care in your approach." The figure did not startle, did not retreat. Instead, after a brief pause, he inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement. "You wished to remain unseen," Holmes continued, "and yet you wished also to be known." The figure remained silent, but there was no resistance in his stillness, only a quiet readiness. Holmes's tones softened further. "There is no need for distance now." For a moment, the night seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the figure stepped forward, one step, then another, until he stood just at the edge of the doorway. For the first time, the light from within touched him fully. A man, simply dressed, calm in his bearing, his face composed, though touched with something deeper, not fear, not urgency, but quiet hesitation, long carried. He held no note, only his presence. Holmes did not move further, nor did I. We allowed the moment to settle. "You have come a long way," Holmes said softly. The man regarded him for a moment, then spoke. His voice, when it came, was low, measured, and steady. I wished to be certain. Holmes inclined his head. "Of what?" The man's gaze shifted briefly toward the room, the fire, the quiet space within. "Of this," he said. A silence followed. But it was no longer uncertain. It was complete. The distance that had once defined the exchange had closed, not suddenly, not forcefully, but gently, step by step. Holmes stepped slightly aside. "You are welcome," he said. The man hesitated only briefly, then crossed the threshold. Inside, the warmth of the room met him. The fire crackled softly. The clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick. And for the first time since the beginning of this quiet mystery, the visitor stood not beyond the door, but within. There are endings that arrive with noise and revelation, and there are those that settle gently, like the last ember in a quiet fire. This was the latter. The man who had stood for so many nights beyond the threshold of 2021B now stood within it, still, composed, and silent for a moment, as though allowing himself to adjust, not to the room, but to the absence of distance. The fire cast a soft glow across his features. His coat, though simple, was well kept. His posture carried neither fear nor urgency, only a quiet restraint, as though he had spent many nights deciding whether to take this final step. Sherlock Holmes closed the door behind him without sound. No rush, no sudden movement, only the gentle settling of a moment long anticipated. "You have come," Holmes said, his voice calm and welcoming. The man inclined his head. Yes, his voice was steady, though softened by something unspoken. Holmes gestured lightly toward the chair opposite the fire. "Pray, be seated." The man hesitated only briefly before taking the offered seat. He did not sink into it, nor did he remain rigid. Instead, he sat as one who had reached a place of pause and allowed himself, at last, to rest. I remained nearby, observing quietly, aware that, whatever this encounter was to become, it required no interruption. For a time, no one spoke. The fire crackled softly. The clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick. Holmes took his seat once more, his posture relaxed, his gaze attentive but unintrusive. "You have taken great care," he said after a moment. The man gave a small nod. "I did not wish to intrude." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "And yet, you wish to be received." Faute of phone. Faint breath escaped the man, something close to agreement. Yes, there was no urgency in the exchange, no rush to explanation, only a quiet unfolding. "I have observed this house," the man continued slowly, "for some time." Holmes did not appear surprised. "You sought certainty," he said. "Yes." The man's gaze drifted briefly toward the fire, watching the soft movement of the flames. "There is a difference," he added, "between being seen and being understood." Holmes inclined his head. A distinction many fail to make. The man's expression softened slightly. "I wished to know which it would be." "And now?" Holmes asked. The man looked up. His answer came simply, "I know." A gentle silence followed. There was no triumph in it, no sense of a puzzle solved in dramatic fashion, only the quiet completion of something that had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. Holmes leaned back slightly in his chair. "You chose your method well," he said. "Patience reveals far more than haste." The man gave a faint, almost reflective smile. "I had time." Holmes's gaze sharpened. Just a fraction, not with suspicion, but with understanding. "Yes," he said softly, "I believe you did." The conversation did not deepen into urgency, nor did it turn toward danger or distress. Whatever had brought the man to Baker Street had not been a matter of crisis, but of certainty, of finding a place where silence could be met with silence and understood. At length, the man rose, not abruptly, not reluctantly, but with the quiet ease of one who has completed what he came to do. "I will not trouble you further," he said. Holmes stood as well. "You have not troubled us at all." The man inclined his head once more, this time not from the shadows of the mist, but within the warm light of the room. "Thank you." Holmes returned the gesture. "Good evening." I followed. As Holmes opened the door once more, the night outside remained as it had been, soft with mist, quiet beneath the steady glow of the lamps. The man stepped out onto the street. He paused only briefly, then turned, offering one final glance, not searching, not uncertain, but calm. Then he walked on, not hurried, not concealed, simply onward. The mist received him gently, though this time it did not seem to hide him, only to accompany him. Holmes closed the door softly. The latch settled into place with a quiet finality. When we returned upstairs, the room felt unchanged, and yet subtly lighter. The notes still rested upon the table, their purpose now complete. I looked at them once more. What will you do with them? I asked. Holmes glanced briefly in their direction. Nothing, he said. They have already said what they needed to say. He took his seat once more, his posture relaxed, his gaze drifting toward the fire. The clock continued its gentle rhythm. Tick, tick. I settled back into my chair, the quiet of the room wrapping itself once more around the familiar shapes and sounds. The mystery had not ended with revelation. There had been no dramatic confession, no sudden uncovering, only a quiet meeting, a distance closed, a silence understood, and in that understanding, a resolution. Outside, Baker Street remained as it always had. The lamps glowed softly, the mist drifted without urgency, the night carried on undisturbed. And within 2021B, the fire burned low, the clock marked its steady time, and all was, once more, at rest.